Howdy folks, it is Scanner here. In today's video we're going to go through Tuomas's design notes for the Invasion of Eire, which he was kind enough to share with me and give some interesting insight into how the narrative develops, some fun little tidbits about the world of Trench Crusade and the world state of Trench Crusade, and also there's some fun kind of connections to Irish history here that I want to talk through. Now, I can only really speak to how kind of smart I feel in ways the lore is developed in relation to Irish history, and I thought this would be a good time to do so. So, I'm going to just basically read sections of the notes and then we will talk about them. So, faithful sea admirals all believe that Zacchur must have had a land base of operations to launch his fleet. But with the Northern Atlantic and North Sea firmly in the grasp of the heretics, it has been impossible to pinpoint their home harbour. Ultima Thule is theorised to be such a base, while others fear that somewhere in the broken coast of Scandinavia there is an unknown heretic enclave. So from this, we can kind of take that it's not just the big behemoth-class ships that give them such terrifying presence in the sea. It definitely confirms that the map that was shown is a narrative map. It's not like a perfect knowledge map. So it doesn't have any of these bases on them if they exist. Now, this may have been left out of the lore to stop people getting too caught up in what is the case if they don't actually have such a base. You know, the way people love to theorize. And so people might have gone, well, if they don't have such a base, and what if the sea admirals are wrong and it could not exist and just not enough people have witnessed the behemoth class ships to factor them in? Or there could be something like the fan theory about the Leviathan, who acts as a mobile portal for the infernal navies and all that kind of stuff. Basically, the sheer presence of saying that, like, you know, the sea admirals believe that they might have a base might distract people from the main aspect of the lore drop, which was actually talking about the invasion of Eire and what happened from that, rather than what led to that, which might come at a different point. So yeah, just thought that was interesting and thought that was worth talking about. I'm taking it that they do have the base, that there is definitely something out there that's allowing them to have this like incredibly strong presence, and it's not just those big behemoth class ships. And remember, for the behemoths, the only thing capable of taking on the behemoths that we know of in the lore so far has been the moving fortress of Britannia. So pretty interesting. So from the notes it says, the faithful nations were rightfully afraid of the heretic dominance over the seas and were unwilling to risk their navies, especially after England's defeat in the Battle of Bloody Cliffs. The crown of Aragon and Castile might have had enough strength, but decided that keeping the shipping lanes to the New World open was even more important. So, for those who don't know, in the Trench Crusade universe, the crown of Aragon and Castile, that's basically Spain. They're the two, I don't want to simplify Spanish history here or anything, but they're the two nations that kind of combined together via marriage, I guess. So I've got some notes here. This is like a really important part of the lore. It gives us some insight into an extremely popular topic, which is the concept of the can't be called Americas, but kind of have to call them Americas so people know what we're talking about here, or the New World, as they say. I don't want to like sidetrack too hard in this video, and there'll be another one coming specifically about this topic in general, but it's worth noting that, you know, with everything that could be lost, with a full takeover of Eire at that time and the establishment of like a permanent base there by the heretics, there was not enough to make the crown of Aragon and Castile give up on the idea of the route to the New World, or cede control of whatever it was that they had found there to whoever it might be that they're fighting over it. So we can't know at this point if they were aware of the Hellgate on Ireland and if that was factoring into their decisions, if they thought maybe it is a lost cause, or if it would have swayed their decision making in either direction if they knew about it or didn't know about it. It may have just been a part of the reason why they felt that it wasn't worth the risk in general of losing their entire navy in the defense, as it was only really Bridget's smart play politically that managed to buy Eire any real chance here. So if Proto-Spain, I insultingly call it Proto-Spain, I'm very sorry. If Proto-Spain really is caught up in a war in the New World, or in trying to hold on to land in the New World, they'll be suffering from the same forces of attrition that the British felt, right, during the American Revolution. So they will need to focus all of their presence just on getting ships, getting supplies, getting people across, depending on what is occurring there. So I think that's incredibly interesting for the world state, and hints at potentially what might happen in the New World in Trench Crusade. Now, I have a lot of research to do there. I don't want to wade into that topic without having at least tried my best to know more about how that played out historically. So you can expect to have to wait a minute for me to get around to that full video. So from the lore, the Crown of France recognized the danger of Eire falling to the heretics. So despite suffering great losses at sea, it kept a flow of reinforcements and supplies going. They staged a great diversionary operation that allowed the papal ship to bring the paladin on chase to Eire in secret. So not only are the French really kind of digging in and helping out in general, but the strong implication is that without the French presence, it would have been very hard to get on chase there to deal with the Hellgate. So Trench Crusade really likes having little echoes of historical behavior. And I know this drives people fucking crazy, because they do it a lot in unrelated things, and it makes people crack, because people get very caught up in the exactitudes of history instead of kind of understanding that Trench Crusade is not even close to an alternative history of Europe or the world or anything like that. It's an alternative development of man, and it likes to take kind of isolated incidents of behavior and examine that behavior under different circumstances. So, in much the same way that the French helped America in the Revolutionary War, they're also helping out Eire, right, in Trench Crusade in a similar way, by sending troops and supplies, and even committing their own ships and losing ships in naval actions. So France don't want Ireland being taken over, basically. They will, if it happens, suffer extensive raiding along the coast, almost guaranteed. And this help is essentially likely to buy them opportunity to build their own bases and ports along the Irish coast if they manage to pull off this defense. They're playing a diplomatic game here. So that's pretty important and pretty interesting, because they might also have been aware in an alternative universe, as in the real world, where none of the events of Trench Crusade happened, French national side footballer Thierry Henry would be responsible for one of the greatest diplomatic woundings ever committed on a pitch, when he blatantly and knowingly used his hand to control the ball not once but twice in a World Cup qualifier match, and would pass it off to William Gallas to get France through the 2010 World Cup, costing Ireland their place. So, my headcanon is that somehow in the Trench Crusade universe, they know that Thierry Henry is a fucking scumbag. And that's why they were doing this. But anyway, so, back on topic. Queen Bridget. This is from the notes. Queen Bridget, who at one point in the notes, she's actually called Brigda, which I'll get to in a second. But Queen Bridget felt that the only way for Donal to have the required authority with the clan nobles was to make him Queen's consort. At first, this was a marriage of strategic necessity, as Donal was unused to the court life, but it grew to be a true partnership. So as I said, at one point in the notes, her name is actually Brigda. I imagine that was changed because that's more Norse than Gaelic. So Bridget seems to have been pretty consistently willing to put country over everything else in the lore. And this is like the first big move that she made after she became queen. She like married Donal. Donal clearly had the tactical nuance to be a very strong military leader, but there's no real point in going to bat for him unless she like marries him, basically, unless she elevates him to that position where people just have to listen to him. She doesn't have time, and they don't have time for Donal to need to convince everybody that he's got the chops, to win these fights. So the only way to have him taken seriously, basically, by the other nobles was to give him rank that they had no option but to respect. So, some fun stuff about the names here. Donal actually means ruler of the world, and Bridget means exalted one or high one. And she's likely named after Saint Bridget, who's the mother saint of Ireland. The assumption is that Bridget would have been born roughly 600 years before the gates of hell in Jerusalem were opened. But the interesting thing about Saint Bridget historically is they don't know if she was real or not. So she carries like a tremendous amount of associations with the original Bridget of the Tuatha and was daughter of Dagda, who's the chief of that OG set of gods in the Irish Gaelic pantheon. So as such, Saint Bridget is more than likely the Christianization of that pagan god, and the church did this quite a lot to make things more palatable. Anybody who doesn't know about the children of Yggdrasil that I've been working on with Westphalia, I like reverse that vibe there. It's good fun. I'll have a video on then coming very soon. But yes, it's like that's what the church used to do. They'd show up and they'd magically happen to have a saint who was totally like your local pagan gods or whatever, and they would just like kind of make it interchangeable in that way. But I do kind of like that, especially with regards to Bridget, because she's such an important person with regards to how things are going for Ireland in Trench Crusade, and there is paganistic tendency in Ireland, which we'll come to later, but it is an issue for some of the church. Alrighty, so from the notes, the Fianna were the second coming of these roving mercenary bands. When the Great War started, the demand for mercenaries grew, and inspired by the tales of old, young Irish hellraisers resurrected this tradition, heavily influenced by the old pagan tales. This led them into a conflict with the church, though most of them considered themselves to be good Christians. Some priests do accompany their wild bands, tending to their spiritual needs. However, the confessors of the court managed to exclude Fianna from being part of the Irish regular forces and forced them to live outside of most cities and settlements. Many Fianna have gained much experience abroad as mercenaries and fighting the cults of the Path of the Beast in the wilds. Now remember, when it says confessors of the court, it's not talking about the court of the seven-headed serpent there. It's talking about the court of the Irish leadership, of the rulers, lords, etc. of Eire at the time. Now, there's a dude on Twitter who gets like fucking worked every time the Fianna gets mentioned. I think it's hilarious. So we're going to dedicate some time to this so you can mold. And the Fianna were historically small roving bands of hunter warriors. They're usually like landless young men with not much better to do because they had yet to like inherit land. So they lacked land-bound responsibilities, which is basically what really kind of forced people to pay attention to their lives in Ireland at the time of the Brehon Laws. So a bunch of young lads who ostensibly they believe in God, they run around the place and are cosplaying as like followers of the Morrigan or Silver Arm or whomever. It actually feels really fucking on point, to be honest, for Ireland. Ireland's always had a really interesting relationship with Catholicism, and it even says in the notes, most of which consider themselves to be good Christians, not all of them. And I'd argue a lot of, let's just call it what it is, the dogmatic view of Catholicism in Ireland became more and more entrenched because the English and Scots were trying to wipe it out at various points in history. Had that not been the case, had there not been a reason to take it on as part of a kind of burgeoning national identity, it's highly unlikely that Ireland would be as Catholic as it is, ironically. You don't go from things like the Brehon Law, which were sophisticated and quite advanced for the time, like open laws that tried to treat people fairly. You don't go from things like that to full-on Christian doctrine at like almost every level at government by the time government was, officially formed as we made the Republic of Ireland. The catalyst of oppression is essentially required for that to happen. So at the end of the day, the British were not coming over and killing us and making our language essentially illegal because we had fair laws around inheritance and divorce and things like that. They were not denying us the right to own land for any reason other than the fact that we were like Irish and we were Catholic, and they couldn't be having with Roman fucking popery. If you tell an Irish dude it's wrong to be Catholic, he's gonna be super fucking Catholic cubed, essentially. So the idea that the church really wanting Ireland to be super Catholic and young folks embracing a little pleasant paganism is a really fun inversion of that history. And I don't know maybe how much like Tuomas was consciously playing into that, but he's shown to have a pretty good read on how these things can go. So the Fianna are rolling around the place, they're fighting a bit, they're going where they're needed to go, and they're being pushed out by the church right up until around 1890, when Bridget lifted the ban on the Fianna. It's likely that until this point, Fianna troops were fighting abroad, which is another thing historically that Irish men tend to do, because nationally we hold neutrality, which is like, I don't really want to get into here, it's a very complex subject as regards Ireland, but Irish men have a reasonably strong history of joining foreign forces, many of which actually joined the British Armed Forces. So that's a fun little kind of thing as well. And, they might have been trying to organize their own skirmish level resistance against hell and things like that, but they wouldn't have been able to take part in pitched battles, essentially, until the ban was lifted by Bridget. Against, it should be noted, the advice of the people around her, but fuck them. So, from the notes, the Mendelist order accuses the Fianna of stealing the secret serums from a Mendelist ship lost in the Irish Sea. They claim that the berserker genetic strain that runs in some Fianna warriors comes in fact from their communicant research. The Fianna laughs at such claims, but this is a constant strain in their relationship with the princes of the church. Now, this is something that I already examined myself for reasons that will become apparent later on in the year, I guess. But I really like this section because it's what I felt would be necessary. So for those who don't know, this is basically hinting at the overall challenge within Trench Crusade, right? Ultimately, Trench Crusade needs to keep focus on the Abrahamic religions and their concepts for the lore to keep standing up and not like just sag under the weight of accommodation. I feel like accommodation would be a mistake. On the other hand, lore drops like the recent psychotic lore revelation that the means of creation are not just, reachable by mortals, but can also be manipulated by them, implies that there are functions of existence that can be tied to God and that other cultures may have interpreted in their own ways. So the berserker concept, it can exist in Trench Crusade, be outside the standard mechanics such gifts would be granted within that world, have an explanation within local religious structures or paganistic beliefs. The Eire Rangers and the Fianna having berserkers is a pretty clear fucking nod to Cuchulainn, a hero of Irish mythology who's so dank that he's actually appeared in like a bunch of anime, particularly the Fate series. So Cuchulainn will go through a process called the Rheostrad, or warp spasms was the translation given to it by, I believe, Thomas Kinsella, who's like an Irish poet, well, was an Irish poet, translator, R.I.P., who took like old stories called the Ramscala, or like they're pre-tales, if you would, of an Irish epic called An Táin, and he covered a section about Cuchulainn and the warp spasm, which I actually want to talk about here. So this is from Thomas Kinsler's translation of Anton. The first warp spasm seized Cuchulainn and made him into a monstrous thing, hideous and shapeless, unheard of. His shanks and his joints, every knuckle and angle and organ from head to foot, shook like a tree in the flood or a reed in the stream. His body made a furious twist inside his skin, so his feet and shins and knees switched to the rear, and his heels and calves switched to the front. The bald sinews of his calves switched to the front of his shins, each big knot the size of a warrior's bunched fist. On his head, the temple sinews stretched to the nape of his neck, each mighty, immense, measureless knob as big as the head of a month-old child. His face and features became a red bowl. He sucked one eye so deep into his head that a wild crane couldn't probe it onto his cheek out of the depths of his skull. The other eye fell out along his cheek. His mouth weirdly distorted, his cheek peeled back from his jaws until the gullet appeared. His lungs and liver flapped in his mouth. His lower jaw struck the upper a lion-killing blow, and fiery flakes large as a ram's fleece reached his mouth from his throat. So, that's the berserker, basically, within Irish lore, Irish mythology. That's what the Fianna would have associated as being a berserker. So, the idea that, like, they would have this in their history, it would be a part of what they understood of Irishness, and they might go into battle and, you know, fucking Padraig down the road might freak out and become, like, immune to damage for a minute and start busting shit up real hard. Like, that wasn't necessarily a shock to them, and the idea that they would require the Jesus juice just to make this happen didn't make a huge amount of sense to them. So that's not what happens in Trench Crusade, obviously. I just wanted to cover this because Kinsler's translation of Anton has been like a huge influence on my own style of writing. You can probably, if you've read any of my in-universe stories that I write, you might see the tone, the staccato nature of the way that I describe physicality, I guess. So the rules state that the berserker trait can be made to manifest with communicant process, but it's pretty clear here that the Fianna and the Irish feel that this was a thing before all that started, and is likely something that they know they can manifest themselves. The communicant process might just result in a more pronounced version of it than is possible without the Jesus juice. And these tensions could be a reason why there might be that lack of help from the church until Bridget managed to wrangle a paladin through her clever wordplay. Alrighty, so due to great services he'd done in the name of Folklore, Zacchur's life was greatly extended and his vigour maintained. Thus Eire was plagued by his dark genius for almost a century, making him almost invincible on the battlefield due to his experience, goetic powers, and superiority of numbers and weaponry at his disposal. He also concentrated all the power in his own hands, which made him such an important opponent to take out. So, one of the main issues with Zacchur basically was his magically extended life. You didn't have the natural attrition of war when it came to dealing with him. He was always present, he was always there. He could literally just sit in the back and play a very patient game, which he's described as doing. But his own self-obsession also meant that he was unwilling to spread his power too thin, and he kind of held on to a lot of it himself. That meant, if it were possible to take him out, you would be striking a terrible blow against the invading force. Now, it seems as though the Irish may have had some spies in their camp, possibly, perhaps slaves that were somehow getting messages and information out to other people. It could also have been some betrayal from within the forces of hell. With Zacchur close to success, somebody may have worried about what this would have meant for him in his positioning in the court and things of that nature, so they may have sought his undoing. Were that what have happened, I would assume the Irish would never have mentioned that they have made a literal deal with a devil in order to bring this thing to an end, because that would certainly put them on the outs with the church and probably result in very, very, very bad things from the rest of the faithful nations. So just in case that is what happened, I can understand why there'd be no mention thereof. So the main lore drops mentions a beast guard that was fooled. This may have been some kind of like terrible creature that guarded Zacchur, akin to a sphinx maybe, or it may have been some kind of oracle with a mystic vision of the ship that Zacchur was on, and they may have been able to like hide their presence from it. Regardless, they blew up the ammunition cache, destroying the ship, and the resultant explosion tearing Zacchur to pieces. So he made the mistake of making himself the most valuable piece on the board for multiple reasons. So even though it would have been ridiculously difficult to actually do, by focusing on trying to take him out, by making that play, by making it in conjunction with having Anchase go after the Hellgate, there was that possibility of victory where there really shouldn't have been any. We see this like numerous times throughout Trench Crusade lore, is hell costs itself over and over the win. These characters, these people, these demons, they're greedy, they're selfish, they're fucking stupid. They're not like shining examples of what it is that makes mankind, or what could have been mankind, good. So from the notes, Zacchur's war was not of pure destruction. He wanted to transform Eire into a real permanent heretic domain. Bringing more worshippers into his fold would have allowed the great duke to raise in the hierarchy of the court the seven-headed serpent. So we also consistently see this with hell. Zacchur was not in it to wipe out the island, kill everybody on it. He wanted to take it over and create a true heretic domain, or a true heretic nation. Convincing people to join hell is a huge part of what hell is actually trying to do on Earth, to turn their back on God and betray their own people, their own kind, their own very soul. And we see that with like Avignon and things like that. So they would allow themselves to go through this slow battle, because if more heretics are dying, who gives a shit? Pain is pain, blood is blood, death is death. It all has value to hell. And this could win them a self-sustaining foothold in the northwest of Europe. Like an entire nation, not just a base off somewhere. So Ireland at the time was a seedy blend, shall we say, of arable land, thick ancient forests that could have been, worked for wood to make more fleets, etc. It would have been very easy to feed armies and to build ships with that combination. There would also have been like really good supplies of things like zinc and lead and gypsum and marble and copper and gold and silver. All that stuff plentiful at the time. With the British Navy destroyed and France potentially making the mistake of expending too much to help the Irish, they could have actually turned Ireland into a stronghold. We have no reason to believe at this point that they knew anything about Britain's plans for the moving fortress, which I'm assuming would have just shit-stomped them by the time that thing came online. Okay, so from Tuomas's notes, Zacchur's invasion plans take many cues from Cromwell's campaign in our world, but the pace was much slower. He wanted to integrate the conquered areas under a clear hierarchy and rule of hell before moving forward. Eire is also superbly defensive land, making the progress slower, but Zacchur and his master had all the time in the world, and they wanted to make sure the cities that they conquered were converted fully, both materially and spiritually, before moving on. Compared to most invasions of Ireland, his war was still quite fast. Alrighty. Now, this is going to be the longest section because it's the most loaded and it's the most chance to be wrong and have people agree with me, and that's what's fun. So according to the notes, basically the plan would have played out in a similar fashion to what Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell, for those who don't know, is one of the most hated fucking men in Irish history. To be honest, most of the British folks aren't all that fond of him fucking either, to be fair. So this entire section of history is pretty wild, and I want to do like a much longer, more detailed video about it, just really breaking down how the invasion might have gone geographically and tactically, based on what Cromwell did. But for this video, Cromwell was what was called a parliamentarian, and he did not support the British Crown or wish to support the British Crown. Nicknamed the Roundheads, largely due to the shape of the helmets that they wore, they were armed forces of the short-lived Commonwealth of England, an entity that lasted roughly from 1649 to 1660. This was during a short-lived stint where the Kingdom of England was a republic, after the execution of Charles I and Charles II had gone into exile. So Ireland presented Cromwell with a problem, because Ireland had managed to have a semi-successful Catholic uprising in 1641 that was spurred on by this tactic called the plantations. They were land seizures that saw land taken away from Catholic owners and giving to colonizing English and Scottish planters. This uprising saw a confederacy created, or at the very least proclaimed. This would lead to a further war between the Irish Confederacy at that point, Irish royalists who continued to support the Crown, Scottish, what were called Covenanters, who were wankers. I don't know what else people want me to say about them. And the Roundheads, the parliamentarians. Cromwell, feeling a lot of danger from the fact that the Irish Confederacy had agreed to support Charles II and proclaim him the King of Ireland, saw an end to the fighting between the Catholics and the Royalists, who both turned together on the Roundheads. Ireland was also a time bomb in another way, as these massive loans had been levied against the armed seizure of all the land during the plantations, and with those now completely fucked, about £10 million or £2 billion today, the only way to repay those loans would be to reconquer Ireland. It had to happen. They didn't have a choice. Where it gets fun, and where we see another neat inversion of real-world history, is many parliamentarians considered Irish Catholics to be heretical, and interpreted Cromwell's actions in Ireland as to almost be akin to a crusade. And this is why Cromwell was just so fucking violent and vicious at points, because he felt empowered by this approval of what was occurring back home. So Cromwell, unlike our boy in Trench Crusade, Zacchur, was feeling intense time pressures to get this done. He needed it to happen. He needed to close away those fucking loans, which is pretty much why he did it himself. Zacchur had all the time in the world, and if anything, the longer he dragged his shit out, and the more it would cost the French, and the rest of the faithful would need to sit there and watch as Ireland slowly had the life strangled out of it. And that would have a potentially enormous effect on the overall morale of the faithful nations, because you all get to sit there and wonder, if we're invaded next, is everybody going to sit around and fucking watch? Welcome to being a small country on the world stage. I don't want to be too dickish about it, but that's essentially what happened anyway in real life. So, I'm going to guess that elements of various governments loyal to hell could do a lot with this, and accuse each other of cowardice and maybe chipping away at any alliances between faithful nations, and their little spies could really get to work. The lore also speaks of a deal that Zacchur made with the cult of the moon, which is the element of the path of the beast that was present in Ireland. Cromwell had no such deal, basically. A lot of the Scottish royalists were happy to side with the Irish Catholics early in the fighting, rather than lump in with the parliamentarians. The cult of the moon deal feels more like it's representative of the rebellion and fighting that was happening before the arrival of Cromwell IRL. Things that were draining the resources, costing men, costing lives. We know that Zacchur made landfall near Dublin, Ballyoclea, in the notes. So this is likely Rathmines, which is the exact same place that Cromwell landed. Cromwell landed there as it was close to the only parliamentarian base left in the country at that point in time. He had no other choice but to land there. They had the risk of losing that base, basically. From there, you can get pretty interesting, and you can interpret all manner of things. But if we assume a similar movements across the country, Zacchur more than likely followed real Cromwell and his plan and took the ports. Cromwell took Drogheda, giving him landing sites north and south of Dublin, and Drogheda and Rathmines. This is also one of the places where Cromwell's intentions became very obvious, as he ordered no quarter to be given at that point, and people were killed even after surrendering, while they were sheltering in churches, things of that nature. Historians estimate about 3,500 people were killed during the fall of Drogheda, including women and children. So for many parliamentarians, it wasn't just about taking Ireland, you see, it was also about punishing it. So slaughtering civilians wasn't necessarily an issue for them at that point in time. This actually led to increased resistance elsewhere, and later on in his campaign, Cromwell would be a bit fucking hammer around places like Clonmel and Kilkenny, where he'd accept and uphold surrender terms. So Cromwell essentially changed, in a way, how the English governed Ireland. General levels of violence went way up. Land seizures went way up. Even compared to the prior plantations, they went way up. There was a very famous saying of the Heller to Connacht, Connacht being seen as a portion of Ireland that had very undesirable land. So when asked what were the Catholics to do based off his plans, he basically said they can go to hell or to Connacht. Now, it might be apocryphal, but it pretty much sums up that point of history. So historians estimate that during this period of time in Irish history, anywhere from about 600 people or so may have died from various means. That would have been half the population of the country at that point in time. So you would expect casualties under Zacchur to be much, much higher. But I get the impression that he was kind of interested in having people come over to the dark side, as it were. I think he was pretty happy to let people run out and be miserable and feel hunted and have nothing and die slow deaths because it was all the same to him. And then they could either just like convert to heretics if they wanted to quote unquote save themselves, or potentially succumb to the path of the beast or join the path of the beast. And rather than just like killing a bunch of fucking Christians, basically, he was like fomenting this hideous, emotional and psychologically scarring churn across the entire country that would have obviously killed far more people overall than even Cromwell managed to do. I also kind of feel like if he was doing what Cromwell was doing, there was likely a flow of people coming into the country from loyal heretic cities in other regions and things of that nature. So by endlessly pushing civilians along the front lines, he would have extended the horror and giving newly arrived settlers easier targets to kill, right? It's not enough to bring people to the island. You need to have fresh arrivals prove their mettle, maybe in ritualistic killings, murders, or just straight up hunting parties that were out there chasing down Irish people and slaughtering them. So we can assume that within the world of Trench Crusade, as land was lost and cities fell, the Irish resorted to hit and run guerrilla tactics just like they did against Cromwell. Ireland was only heavily deforested due to heavy colonial activity, basically. And in the Trench Crusade world, those old thick forests would still have been present. Lots of hills, lots of valleys, mountainy regions, lots of bogs, stuff like that. In real life, this was making life hell for the parliamentarians. They could never take advantage of their numbers at this stage of their action. So I suspect that Fianna, in the world of Trench Crusade, would have had a similar advantage. Take it from an Irish dude. Under prolonged invasion, the important thing is that you maintain resistance, no matter how small that resistance is. Various bands of warriors out there showing up and slaughtering some heretic priest in the name of Christ and his entire retinue, and then disappearing into the mists, that would have done a fucking lot to keep our belief in Christ alive during this period of the war. So we can assume that they would have ran endless raids on heretic supplies, taking every chance they could. Now in time, they were able to get their shit together and get a paladin and take out both the Hellgate and Zacchur, winning the war, but a considerable portion of time would have been spent in this violent churn, just trying to survive what Zacchur was attempting to do, and fighting back as best they could. So from the notes, despite heretic rule over much of Eire for decades, resistance and secret teachings of faith and language were never stamped out in occupied parts of Ireland. This also aided Donal once he launched his counterattack, that there were many traitors too. So one of the more insidious aspects of British rule at certain points in Ireland was that they would pass laws, not just from stopping Catholics from owning land and things of that nature, but also aimed at things like the suppression of Irish language, the suppression of Irish culture. The point was to force Irish people to assimilate. And the assumption was that this would eventually kind of stop the gnawing at the yoke that they had become famous for. The aim was to force conversion over to the Protestant Church of Ireland instead of Catholicism. So the secret teachings, as mentioned here, is likely a reference to what were called hedge schools and hedge church, which were secret meetings where elements of Irishness and the Catholic faith and Irish culture would be taught. The lore states that some 50% of the population died during the invasion, with fighting and famine and people fleeing the island. We don't actually know what the starting population was at the time, but assuming similar populations to 1800s in Ireland, it's likely that 3 to 4 million people would have died under Zacchur. That makes a degree of sense, as it's transplanting that Cromwellian tactic onto a population that was much, much larger than when Cromwell invaded. Like at the time that Cromwell would have invaded Ireland, there would have been maybe like 1.2, 1.3 million people living on the island. By the time the famine occurred within Ireland, that had gone up to above 8 million, which is roughly the time that Zacchur would have invaded Ireland. Now, I'm not saying they definitely had a population that high. There's all kinds of reasons as to why their population was that big. But if that was like the first major invasion that they were suffering, then yeah, they probably did have a population of around that big. So, you know, pretty scary shit basically in the world of Trench Crusade to have like 3 to 4 million people basically getting wiped out or dying from hunger or, you know, succumbing to the path of the beast or succumbing to the path of the beast, I guess. So yeah, that's all the notes basically, that taking the lead of Cromwell is really interesting. That's really kind of one of the things that I want to highlight. I don't have a problem with it. I think if you're going to do this type of game and if you want to take inspiration from real world, I would have more of an issue if there was an attempt made to be like, oh, in this alternative reality, Cromwell's like, you know, he's alive and he's a named character and he's a hero of England and stuff. I think a lot of other people, I think a lot of English people would have a problem with that. You want to know how much English people or British people hate Cromwell, right? They dug him up after he died. He was buried and he was later dug up and posthumously decapitated as a traitor. And to this day, they still have a problem in British Parliament because there's a bust of him over there and people keep turning it to face the fucking wall. So yeah, like, you know, he's not like he's a great respected historical figure or anything like that. And I think using such figures within reason to look at just how evil people can be and figure out what hell might do on Earth based off that is interesting. And personally, I have no issue with it. So yeah, that's the video. I talked for quite a lot this time, so this is going to take a minute to edit, let me tell you. So, as always, thank you all so much for watching. Huge thanks to Tuomas for sharing his notes with me. I greatly appreciate it. There'll probably be like a super deep dive into how the heretics moved across Ireland. I know I'm biased towards talking about Ireland, but like, the fuck you gonna do? It's my channel. And at some point, like the video only if you actually liked the video. If you haven't subscribed and you want to, feel free, hit the little bell. And don't forget to keep an eye out for my stuff in your subscriptions app. So thanks so much, folks, and all the best.